We're starting off Atari Archive's trek through 1982 with a make good by Apollo by the name of Spacechase and the debut of another company. And so at last we come to 1982, an extremely complicated year for American gaming history and for Atari in particular. As we enter the year, stores and even distributors are struggling to get enough video game product to meet the demand of consumers, and this is particularly true for Atari, the biggest player in the field. Much like similar situations in the coin-op space during the 1970s, think the Pong or Space Invaders booms, other companies are rising up to get a piece of that pie and fill in some of the product gap Atari's left on the table. In 1980, Activision published its first games for VCS, and 1981 saw the introduction of computer magic and games by Apollo to the mix. Apollo's December 1981 game, Skeet Shoot, may have gotten the company's foot in the door in time for the holiday rush, but it was not especially well regarded at the time. Fortunately, their second release, January 1982's Spacechase, is a significant improvement over their freshman outing. And additionally, a new third party enters the fray with US games debuting with Space Jockey. Yes, this video will debut a slightly different format to reflect the oncoming glut of software. In the interests of trying to get through this series in my lifetime, outside of a select few games that deserve the full focus, I'll largely be combining games released the same month into single videos. This will help me get through each month more quickly when we get to the real crush load later in 1982, and also prevent me from having to repeat information when a company releases multiple games in the same month. I'll also add that for both of these games, the January release date is something of a best guess based on Game Magazine reporting. It's clear from newspaper ads that if these games did indeed start reaching stores in January, it was in very limited quantities, as we don't really start seeing a lot of advertisements until February and March. Spacechase went into production in January, and seemingly to store shelves, based on a write-up in Videogaming Illustrated and comments in a PM Magazine TV feature on Apollo. But newspaper advertisements first started appearing in early February. In some ways, Spacechase is a sign of things to come for the coming VCS boom and bust that will run through the next 2 years of the console's lifespan. First, it's a shooter, and a space shooter at that. This was a genre that had really come into its own in the coin-op space and will, later this year, begin inundating the VCS. Secondly, it's a game with some interesting graphical elements. The playfield takes place in a lunar orbit, with enemy ships flying up from the ground to fight you at the start of each new wave. Meanwhile, background elements on the border provide the illusion of actively moving above the ground below. You can say what you will about the quality of VCS software in the period we're entering, but more developers certainly meant new ways of approaching the increasingly creaky platform's limitations. Spacechase comes to us from Ed Salvo, who had sold Skeet Shoot, a game that he'd made in his spare time, to Apollo around October 1981. According to a 2006 interview with Scott Stilphen, Salvo was then contracted by Apollo to create a second game for them, which would eventually be published after the new year as Spacechase. Salvo has alternately said the game took him 6 weeks to write to Stilphen, and 9 weeks in a 1983 interview with Electronic Fun with Computer and Games. He was particularly proud of the graphics in this game. One thing that stands out in Spacechase, other than the visual elements, are the sound effects. The laser and explosion noises are pretty unique at the time that the game came out, and remained rarely imitated in the many shooters to come out in the months and years to come. In Salvo's 2006 interview, he explained that he worked with sound engineer Byron Parks on Spacechase's sound effects. Parks would record a sound effect to tape and then played back the sound by hand and indicated what note it was in. Salvo would then implement the sound as best he could into the VCS, and they'd tweak the pitch to get what they wanted. Parks would go on to work on developing the music and sound effects in several other Apollo games, Salvo remarked. In the PM Magazine video feature on Apollo, they also interviewed a Larry Miner, who worked on audio effects for later Apollo games as well. As for Spacechase itself, the game pits 1 or 2 players in alternating turns against waves of enemy ships. At first the ships are fairly chunky and not particularly challenging to fight against. After scoring 10,000 points, the composition shifts to smaller, more numerous, and more aggressive ships as the game moves to Level 2. Spacechase moves on to Level 3 after 40,000 points, with enemies that are harder to hit and fire more often. Every 10,000 points, you earn a new ship. The point values of the enemies increase with each level and depend on the game variation, while shooting down their missile attacks will net you either 50 points or 100 points, also depending on the game type. Accordingly, Spacechase has 24 variations on the cartridge. These allow you to select which difficulty level you start on between levels 1, 2, and 3, whether or not you're playing with 1 or 2 players, if you want to use day or night graphics on screen, and how frequently enemy ships are using heat-seeking missiles that are harder to avoid and hit. The difficulty switches adjust how fast your own shots move, affecting how much lead time you need to have to hit your foes. Spacechase starts off rather easy, as the level 1 enemies don't pose a great threat, though if you get overly aggressive, they can still hit you with their shots, as your hitbox is unfortunately generous. The level 2 and 3 enemies start lower to the bottom of the screen, making it harder to avoid their volleys, so the difficulty ramps up fast once they show up, or if you start on those levels to begin with. The homing missiles are dangerous, but functionally, even on higher difficulty variations, they don't show up often enough that you'll be inundated with missile dodging, and the fact that they have a telltale sound effect when being fired off lets you know immediately to watch for it. The day and night options are nifty, though this doesn't seem to actually affect the game outside of the color scheme. Essentially, just pick whichever one you think looks cool. Since there's no black and white mode on this cartridge, it's possible one or the other contrasts better on a grayscale television. Hitting the final alien can be a chore given the degree of randomness to their movement, but on the whole the game has a decent difficulty curve. For early 1982, this is a perfectly cromulent title, and a big improvement on Skeet Shoot. It may not have the refinement of an Activision or Atari release, but it looks good, it sounds good, and it plays pretty well. There's just not much depth to it. Salvo indicated that Apollo's office staff handled drafting up the manuals, and unsurprisingly, Spacechase has a rather generic yarn spun in there. Essentially, the player commands a trio of Mark 16 star cruisers on a routine patrol from Earth to the Moon, when alien raiders from another galaxy show up and start attacking you. Your goal, then, is to hold off these forces until reinforcements arrive in the form of your extra lives. It's nothing particularly special, but with Atari embracing the concept of elaborate written stories in their games in 1981, beyond just a basic description of what's happening, this is one of the first times a third party has made that same effort. Bill Kunkel and Arnie Katz of Electronic Games and Video Magazine were clearly fans of Spacechase based on their review. In the May 1982 edition of Electronic Games, Spacechase is described as a game with super visuals and fluid play that rewards skillful players with new types of enemies. They were big on the technical innovation of having enemies on the same horizontal line move independently of one another, and on the threat of unlimited homing missiles from the attackers. As the glut of software for the VCS grew, opinions did shift for Spacechase as it lost its uniqueness to a slew of newer, more elaborate shooting games. Joystik's January 1983 write-up was not quite as positive, noting that it was yet another game where you shoot at alien ships, and they proclaimed that if one already owns Space Invaders, this doesn't have that much new going on. Spacechase was enough of a success to continue encouraging Apollo's president Pat Roper to keep jumping headfirst into the home video game space. In a February 15, 1982 edition of Weekly Television Digest, Roper said that the game had already topped 1 million in sales. He further elaborated in the April 15th issue, where he mentioned that, with just Spacechase and Skeet Shoot on the market, Apollo was bringing in about $500,000 in revenues every month. Comments by Apollo's Director of Public Relations, Emmett Crawford, in the August 1982 edition of Videogaming Illustrated, indicated that the game was backordered by about 200,000 copies at the time the article was written. When Lisa Gibbons led a PM Magazine feature on Apollo, she mentioned the game was the company's bread and butter that had pushed it to success in the video game space, and Salvo indicated it in his interview with Stilphen that Spacechase was one of the company's best-selling cartridges overall. We don't have firm numbers, but it's clear Spacechase was one of the company's best sellers, and it isn't hard to see why, given when it came out, and the subject matter really being in the zeitgeist. This was a time period when Atari in particular was struggling to keep up with demand, after all, so a third party with a decent game could do well for itself. Spacechase also holds the distinction of likely being the first video game that could be customized. For $100, one could direct order a custom version of the game from Apollo itself, with different initials displaying when the player's ship is destroyed. Salvo remembers less than 10 of these were produced, with only 2 confirmed to exist at this time. One owned by former Electronic Games co-editor Arnie Katz, and another made for TV journalist Lisa Gibbons during her feature on Apollo. While this isn't the only customizable cartridge to be sold for the VCS during its lifetime, it is a good indication of Apollo's efforts to stand apart from other companies in the video game space, as well as just how hot the video game market was overall. Following Spacechase, Salvo agreed to join Apollo as the new head of video game development, overseeing the rapidly expanding team of game developers and providing input on others' games, while continuing to work on a few himself. As alluded to in the Skeet Shoot video, Apollo will have an incredible roller coaster of highs and lows over the course of 1982, before closing up shop amidst an unpaid advertising bill. But Spacechase represents the real highs of the company. It's not an amazing game, but it's a very solid one and a major step up for Apollo's software. Meanwhile, US Games' debut title Space Jockey, sold under its VidTech branding, appears to have also hit shelves in late January based on reporting in Videogames, though the newspaper reporting suggests it rolled out in real numbers that March. Space Jockey comes to us from Garry Kitchen, who would make a real name for himself with his later works like Donkey Kong and Keystone Capers, but he developed this one while still working for James Wickstead Design Associates. JWDA deserves some additional explanation, as the history of it in US games is rather muddied. I had the opportunity to speak with Wickstead himself back in 2021 about the history of his company, and thanks to some news clips shared in the Gaming Alexandria Discord, I was able to clarify a few things he misremembered, on top of that to get a really good sense of both JWDA and US Games history. JWDA had a long-running relationship with toy company Parker Brothers, with JWDA developing electronic games and toys for them like the pool game Bankshot or the handheld Wildfire Pinball after Mattel's football handheld took off. Wickstead remembered folks from California recommending that they get into video games, as it was a hot market and no one was developing on the East Coast at the time. Initial concerns about Atari's intellectual property rights fell to the wayside as Garry Kitchen reverse-engineered the hardware with help from a coworker experienced with programming to help make sense of the console's software routines. This was a little outside the company's comfort zone. While JWDA had experience with software, Wickstead said their lack of hardware experience was something they were all nervous about. Being too small an operation to be selling its own games, JWDA developed a partnership with other folks in California to form US Games, which sold both LED games and video games, the latter under the VidTech branding. Don Yu, based out of California, led the company as president. JWDA would make games for US Games, both video and traditional, and US Games would sell them. Wickstead remarked this linkage with folks on the West Coast to form US Games worked out great for JWDA, as it allowed them to focus on the matter of creating games while letting someone else handle actually selling it, something he said was not terribly difficult given how desperate the marketplace was for new Atari software. Space Jockey would be the sole US Games video game published before the company was purchased by Quaker Oats that April, which was already involved in games and toys, generally through its subsidiary toy giant Fisher-Price. Wickstead said that they'd already had a relationship with Fisher-Price before the sale, having done some work for them. And under the agreement, JWDA would continue to make games for US Games, developing pretty much every single one. That said, while Quaker Oats and US Games were reported as the exclusive buyer of JWDA video game products, this agreement clearly had some flexibility to it, as JWDA went on to work on VCS games for Coleco, which the company had a pre-existing relationship with, Parker Brothers, and North American Philips under their short-lived Probe 2000 label. Wickstead said that at its height, JWDA had 8 programmers each assigned to a given project, along with a separate electrical engineering team to design any special tech needed for the cartridges. The company received a fee for each game developed on top of royalties, an arrangement Wickstead said worked out very well for JWDA and its employees, even when the market ran into trouble overall. The US Games corporate staff largely appears to have stayed on after the buyout, and Wickstead remembered working with Yu into the Quaker Oats period. Fisher-Price was interested in expanding its market, Wickstead said, and after the buyout it was headquartered out of Fisher-Price's offices, while the VidTech name was eventually phased out in favor of simply going by US Games. This arrangement only seems to have lasted for about a year before Quaker Oats started disentangling itself from the video game space and shuttered US Games amidst the catastrophic downturn. According to an interview with Retro Gamer magazine, Kitchen said he'd spent time working on handheld electronic toys and games, such as the aforementioned Bankshot, with JWDA prior to delving into the VCS when it became clear video games were horning in on their market share. Accordingly, Kitchen designed his own development system using an Apple II and started developing what would become Space Jockey as an engineering experiment that eventually expanded into a full game. Every choice in Space Jockey's game design is the result of these experiments. Space Jockey is a horizontal shooter where the player scrolls from left to right, dealing with enemies as they spawn on screen. This was an understandable choice, even beyond the experimental premise of the game, as horizontally oriented shooters like Scramble and Defender were pretty popular in US arcades at this time. Since Kitchen wanted to experiment with enemies on different scan lines, the game gained its horizontal orientation, something that played to the strengths of the VCS hardware. Kitchen has a variety of targets and animations, clearly playing with the hardware's graphical abilities. Since it was just an experimental game, it was designed to be 2 kilobytes in size, which by this point was becoming a real rarity on the platform. Space Jockey features 16 game variations. These adjust whether or not the player can control their shot's direction after it's been fired, whether or not you have horizontal movement as well, or just vertical, whether or not enemies move randomly, and if collisions destroy your ship. The difficulty switches adjust how frequently your enemies fire their own shots and how fast the bullets are. The different enemy types are worth different points, with planes and tanks netting you 100 points, helicopters 50, balloons 25, and houses and trees 20. Since you earn an extra life every 1,000 points, it makes sense to prioritize whichever will provide you with the best value. Space Jockey really runs the gamut in difficulty level. The game variations that limit your movement and potential for damage make this a pretty easy game to last an eternity in, as you just simply line up a shot and move out of the way before enemies hit you. As long as you don't get too aggressive, you don't have to worry about much actually taking you out. It is very generous with lives. Once you start adding in variations and the difficulty switches, this becomes a proper horizontal shooter with some real teeth. Surprisingly, the ability to control your shot can actually be a net negative, as you'll frequently find yourself moving out of the way of enemy bullets and therefore whiffing your target. The effective movement is different from what Spacechase does, but the basic principle is the same. Move a piece of background element that you can't interact with to make your game seem more dynamic than it is. And it works as well here as it does there, as Space Jockey is a pretty good looking game for the time frame it came out and the cart size. This may have been an experimental game, but it is already clear why Activision would eventually hire on Kitchen. Based on early ads, Kitchen's own interview comments, and newspaper advertisements running near the end of the year, Space Jockey seems to have largely been sold as a discount title, an ominous sign of the market glut to come. This appears to have worked out for JWDA, as Kitchen indicates Space Jockey sold quite well. Yet he was not with JWDA at its debut, having struck out on his own. US Games, meanwhile, gave Space Jockey a fresh push only a few months later when the company was brought under the Quaker Oats umbrella, and with it, a lot more resources. Space Jockey, much like Spacechase, had a pretty positive reception upon its debut. The July 1982 edition of Video saw Kunkel and Katz refer to the game as an outstanding example of a horizontal scrolling shooter on the VCS, gushing about the visual design, animation, and speedy action, while dinging it for a safe spot in the lower left corner that makes the game significantly easier when not played on difficulty A. They further recommended playing it on game type 16, where all the game's options come into play to make it as challenging as possible. Joystik reviewed it in its January 1983 roundup as well, and gave it positive marks as an easy-to-play, fast-moving game, appealing to all ages. The game did receive a mixed reception in August 1983's Logical Gamer, where both reviewers suggested checking it out, but only one clearly indicating it was worth the money to buy. After leaving JWDA, Kitchen scored the subcontract to develop the VCS port of Donkey Kong thanks to his brother Dan's connections to Coleco. He was able to further leverage that into a position with Activision, where he worked on a variety of games such as Keystone Capers and Pressure Cooker. He's still working on VCS software under the Audacity Games label alongside his longtime friend David Crane. And as mentioned, JWDA went on to produce a whole slew of software for the VCS, particularly with games oriented towards young children for US Games, which makes Space Jockey a pretty auspicious debut for both a new developer and a new company. Next time, adventure meets some ghosts.